Hi everyone, in this video, you will learn how to write customized functions in Python. And to do so, we need to follow a few simple Python rules. When writing a function, we need to start with a def keyword. And then we will have to provide a name for the function, followed by a set of parentheses and a colon. Within the parentheses, we can also supply optional parameters. Then we will create the main body with a body of code that serve the purpose of that function. So let's see an example of writing a function. Now in this function, we will learn to write a function to convert distance from meter to kilometer. So the conversion, we can use this simple formula, meter multiplied by 0.001. So let's adhere to the rules of writing a function, first with a def, and supply a name for this function, and we'll call it convert meter to km with a set of parentheses followed by a colon. All right, I will also include a parameter within the parentheses. Let's create a parameter and call it meter. Okay, now this will initialize the function. And then in the next line, we will include a body of code to serve the purpose of that function. And this function is to convert meter to kilometer. And so we can use the same mathematics expression, all right, to convert to kilometer. Now, for the function to return some value, we will use a return keyword, okay? So the return keyword will return the calculated value after the conversion back to the main program. So the way the function works is simply to take a value in a parameter, and the parameter will be assigned with that value, and that value will be multiplied by 0.001. So it is important to ensure the name meter is in the body is the same as the name in the parameter, okay? So really, when you're done with these two lines, you have written your very first function in Python, okay? So let's take a look at how this function works. So to use a function, it is very straightforward. We will just have to use the call for the function name and then supply a value in the meter parameter. Let's supply, say, 10,000. So the intention is to convert 10,000 meter to kilometer, all right? And to take a look at the output, we would have to use the print function. So let's execute the program. So when we execute the program will first create a function based on what we have written. And then in the next line, we will use the function supplying it with 10,000 in the parameter, and that 10,000 value assigned as the parameter will be used in the main body to multiply by 0.001 before returning with this return keyword. So no surprise, it returns to us 10 because 10,000 meter is equivalent to 10 kilometer. Okay, now we can also use this function in a different way besides printing. For example, we can create a variable and say I will create a variable, call it km, and assign the converted value in this function to this variable and print km, and it would also return to us a value of 10. All right. Okay, so we can use the function in different ways depending on our applications. Okay, now let's take note of a few things when we are creating a function. First, if you highlight line 52 and 53, you will notice that there are 4 white spaces at line 53. Now, this 4 white spaces is a default indentation by Python. So the white space is important because it will tell Python that this main body of code is where will happen after the 4 space, okay, 4 white spaces. So without this 4 white spaces, Python will not be able to differentiate between line 52 and line 53, okay? So by default, we will leave it to 4 white spaces, all right? So as you hit enter into the next line, you will notice that Python would still default the next line with 4 spaces, thinking that your function or your body of code has not ended yet until you stopped it, okay? So this is about the indentation for function. Now, also let's take note of the return keyword. Now this return keyword will return a value. If we did not include the return keyword, the function will simply do the multiplication but not giving back the value into the main program. So when we execute the entire program, you will see that the output will return a none when we print km, since it is not returned. So if you want a function to return some values, always include a return keyword. Not all functions will require a return keyword, because some functions is just meant to execute certain part of the program. So when we write a function without a return keyword, it is mainly just to execute certain portion of the program to reduce our code, and then we can reuse the function again and again. Okay. All right. Now, the last part I want to talk about is docstrings. So if you recall from the last video, when we hover our cursor over the print function, we can see the information or the documentation of that print function. And it also tells us what are the parameters that we need to include to make sure that we can use the function correctly. So it is important for documentation because it tells a user or tell us how to use this function, what parameters and value to include to use this function correctly, right? Now we can also do the same when we are creating or writing our own function. And to do that, it is common to include this docstring. Docstring is being denoted with triple quotation, okay? So this marks the start of a triple quotation, and the next 3 triple quotation marks the end. Anything that is between these 2 quotations, the start and the end, is taken into account or is considered, or Python will assume that as some kind of comment. So we can use a triple quotation, or rather commonly called docstrings, to document our information. Okay, so let me just copy and paste the information that I have already created for this function, and I'm just going to paste here to save some recording time. So in this example, when we create some information, we started with 3 triple quotation and close it with 3 triple quotation. In line 54 and 55, it will be considered as some sort of comment. All right. So when that is done, we will then insert our main body of code after that. Okay. So typically the documentation come right after the initialization of that function. Now, so in this case, the documentation is this. First, I give a brief description of the function, and I say that this function converts meter to kilometer, and 1 parameter is required. All right, so we need to supply a parameter, a value, or some values to this parameter of meter in either integer or float. Okay, now when we hover our cursor over the function, you can see that the function or the information within the docstring will be shown here. Okay, now we can, if you recall, we could also use help to print out the information of a function. So if we use convert meter, or we use help on convert meter, and we print the help function, it will tell us that this is the information that we have just put in. Okay, so I hope you find this helpful. Now let's move on to one more example of a function. Now in this example, we will create a function that can take 2 parameters. So a function can take many parameters. So it is common that we can include more than one. So here is an example of creating or writing a function with 2 parameters. Okay, so in this function that we're going to write, we're going to use 2 parameters of height and weight to calculate BMI. And the formula to do that is to use weight divided by height and raise them to the power of 2. Okay, now the units for this height has to be in kilogram, and the unit for the height has to be in meter. Okay, so let's take a look at how to include 2 parameters in a function. So let's use the define keyword to start writing a function, and let's call this a BMI. And we can now supply 2 optional parameter here. Okay, and this will initialize the function. All right, now to use the main body of code would now consist of the formula of weight divided by height raised to the power of 2. And now we have to use the return keyword, because when we do that and when we execute the function, it will return to us the calculated value, right? Okay, so since this 2 parameters is sensitive to the units that enter, it is good to include some form of documentation or information too using the doc strings. Okay, so let's add in 2 pieces of information. First, I describe this function and I say this function calculates BMI with height, with weight and height, and 2 parameters are required. First is the weight and the height, and you will require to put them as a unit of kg and meters. Okay, so let's hover. So if we use the program or we use the function BMI and hover our cursor over it, you can see the information of the function. So a user most likely would not make a mistake of using the wrong unit of measurement. Okay, so in this case, I will enter my height, or rather my weight, at 68 kg and my height at 178. All right, and let's print out this return value from the function. Let me just comment out this few lines on top first. All right, okay, so let's execute this line. All right, so let's execute this entire function, all right, of this BMI and look at the return. Okay, so notice I've entered 178, not in terms of meters, but in terms of centimeter. So if I change this to 1.78 and execute it one more time, now the BMI return is 21.46 and many trailing decimal places, right? Okay, now what we can do further is that we can actually use the built-in function of round to round off to 2 decimal places. So in this case, if I assign this value to a variable, say my BMI, and use a round function, which is built-in function, over the function that I have written, and say I like it to be in 2 decimal place. Now when I print my BMI to check the return output, it should only show 2 decimal places, since this round is being wrapped around within the function that we have created. Okay, so let's execute the program. All right, now the program, one more time, the program will create a function based on what we have written, and then it will execute the inner parenthesis of this BMI function before rounding up the value at 2 decimal places assigned to my BMI variable, and now we print the BMI. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. In the next video, I'm going to talk about the concept of scope in programming. So I will see you in the next video.